You're listening, aren't you? Sitting there in the dim glow of your screen, the night pressing in around you. Maybe you're alone, or maybe you just feel like you are. Either way, you're here now, caught in the web of a story that won't let go. A story about something grotesque, something wrong. I remember the call like a nail dragged across glass. It was late, 2:45 a.m., the kind of hour when even the city seems to be holding its breath. I was already awake, though. Sleep and I had parted ways years ago, ever since I first started seeing what human hands could do when guided by something beyond reason. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to my partner, Detective Calloway. Short, terse, no details, just an address. 47 Redmond Street, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Detroit's industrial graveyard, and 6 words that sent a slow chill creeping up my spine. You need to see this yourself. The air was thick with the cold, pressing into my lungs as I stepped out of my car. The warehouse loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and broken windows, standing like the carcass of something that had died long ago but refused to decay. The police tape snapped in the wind as I ducked under it, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. Inside, the smell hit me first, a sickly blend of industrial dust, old oil, and something far worse. Something that clawed its way down my throat and sat there, heavy and rancid. The first thing I saw was her. She was posed as if caught mid-thought, perched on a wooden stool in the center of the room. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers curled inward slightly, like she had just set something down moments before. Her head was tilted just so, gazing toward the high windows where the moon cast fractured beams of light through the shattered panes. A peaceful expression rested on her face, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to whisper something. She looked alive, except she wasn't. The truth revealed itself in pieces, like my brain was refusing to process it all at once. The color of her skin was wrong, pale, waxy, preserved. And then I saw the seams, thin, careful stitches running along her wrists, elbows, the delicate curve of her jawline, as if someone had taken her apart and put her back together with obsessive care, like a doll. Jesus Christ, Calloway muttered beside me, his breath misting in the cold. I hadn't even realized he was there. My body moved forward before my mind could catch up, crouching in front of her. Closer now, I could see it, the unnatural tautness of her flesh, stretched and smoothed in places where it shouldn't be. The sculpting wasn't just artistic, it was surgical. She's been arranged, I murmured. The words felt too thin for the weight of what I was looking at. Calloway exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. Her name's Rebecca Langley, 28, art student at Wayne State, reported missing 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. She had been gone for 14 days, and now she was sitting here, waiting to be found like some macabre centerpiece in an exhibition no one wanted to attend. I glanced past her, scanning the vast emptiness of the warehouse. That was when I noticed them. Shadows hunched against the walls, their outlines almost human. Almost. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. There were more. 3 other bodies, each arranged in different poses. One man leaned against a crate, arms folded, his head slightly bowed as if in contemplation. Another woman stood as if caught mid-laughter, her mouth sculpted into a frozen grin, hands lifted in an invisible toast. The last was curled on the floor, fetal, as if in peaceful sleep. They weren't just victims, they were art. A scraping sound echoed from the far side of the warehouse. My head snapped up. A loose piece of metal, I told myself. Just the wind-shifting debris, but my pulse disagreed. The hell kind of monster does this? Calloway muttered. I swallowed, tasting copper at the back of my throat. One that thinks he's creating something beautiful. And then I saw it, tucked carefully into the lap of the woman on the stool, half hidden beneath her delicate fingers. A sketchbook. My hands felt too large, too clumsy as I reached for it, flipping it open. The pages were filled with drawings of the victims, not as they had been in life, but as they were now, posed, modified, made perfect. And then, on the very last page, my breath stopped cold in my chest. A drawing of a man, sitting at his desk, head bowed over a case file, a coffee cup on the right, a dim desk lamp casting long shadows. My desk, a perfect sketch of me. The weight of the sketchbook in my hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the pages themselves carried something more than ink. My breath came slow, controlled, but I could feel the tightening in my chest, the sharp awareness creeping into the edges of my mind. The sketch was me. Not a vague resemblance, not a shadow of familiarity. It was precise down to the exact placement of my coffee cup, the subtle slant of my posture, the papers scattered across my desk in a pattern I hadn't even consciously noticed before. The details were impossibly accurate. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been close enough to see the way I worked, the way my fingers tapped absently on the desk when I was lost in thought, the way I sat too still when I was reading something I didn't want to process. I felt Calloway shift beside me, his presence grounding but tense, the kind of tension that coils in your muscles when you don't know whether to run or fight. He was staring at the sketch now, his jaw tightening just enough for me to notice. I didn't need to say anything. He could see it just as clearly as I could. This wasn't a random crime scene anymore. This wasn't just about Rebecca Langley or the three other carefully arranged corpses surrounding us like a grotesque gallery display. This was about me. I turned the pages back slowly, retracing the inked lines of the other victims, their faces frozen in posthumous perfection, their poses chosen with the same meticulous care that an artist might use when arranging figures for a still life painting. There were no smudges, no hesitant strokes, no second guesses. The hands that had drawn these sketches were steady, deliberate, confident in their ability to shape the world into something that fit their vision. I could almost picture him sitting in some dimly lit room, pencil gliding over paper, creating and recreating his masterpieces long before they ever took shape in reality. "We need to process this whole damn building," Calloway muttered, his voice low, the kind of low that masked unease with practicality. "Every inch of it. Prints, fibers, tool marks. Hell, I want to know what brand of cigarettes this guy smokes, if we can find so much as an ash." I nodded, but my mind was still elsewhere, still trapped in the pages of that sketchbook, still trying to understand the implications of what I was holding. The victims had been chosen, posed, preserved with an almost reverential care. Their deaths hadn't been accidents, and they hadn't been impulsive. This was something else. This was the work of someone who saw himself as more than a killer. He was an artist. He wasn't just taking lives. He was curating them. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped me back into the moment. One of the forensic techs, a young woman with sharp eyes and a tired expression, stopped just outside the circle of bodies. Her gloved hands gripped a small evidence bag, and I could see something inside, something metallic, something that caught the dim light in a way that made my stomach clench. "We found this near the back entrance," she said, holding the bag up slightly, her voice carefully neutral. "Tucked behind a stack of crates like someone didn't want it to be noticed right away." I reached for it, my fingers brushing the plastic before I even fully registered what I was looking at. A key, an old-fashioned brass key, tarnished and worn, but the shape was unmistakable. Not just any key, a mortuary key. A slow, sinking realization settled over me like a weighted blanket, the kind of key used in funeral homes. The kind of key that locked the doors to embalming rooms. The kind of key that someone like Elias Mercer, a former mortician with a history of grave robbing and an obsession with the preservation of beauty, would own. Calloway let out a breath that was almost a curse. "You think he's keeping them somewhere before he brings them here?" I nodded, my grip tightening around the bag. "He's not killing them on sight. He's taking his time, preparing them, sculpting them." The word felt wrong in my mouth, but it was the only one that fit. This wasn't rage or impulse or even pleasure-driven sadism. This was something else. This was obsession. The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, the air more stifling, the shadows heavier. The victims had been missing for days, possibly weeks before they were found here. That meant there was another place, another room where the real work was being done, where the transformation was happening before they ever arrived at their final stage. And if that was true, if Elias Mercer had another space, another workshop, then that meant someone else could be there right now. Someone still alive. Someone waiting for their turn to be perfected. I turned toward Calloway, my voice steady but edged with urgency. We need to move now. If he's taken someone else, they don't have long. He didn't argue. He just nodded, already reaching for his radio, already calling in the orders that would set everything into motion. And as we stepped back out into the cold Detroit night, the key still pressing against my palm through the plastic, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The key sat on the dashboard as we drove, its tarnished brass surface catching the occasional flicker of passing streetlights, a dull glint that felt almost like a pulse. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a path, a door waiting to be opened, a silent promise that something waited on the other side. Calloway gripped the wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale against the dark leather, his jaw tight as he navigated through the empty streets of Detroit's industrial district. Neither of us spoke much, because there wasn't anything left to say. There was only the weight of the moment, the silent understanding that whatever we found next, it wouldn't be easy to walk away from. The address tied to Elias Mercer's last known residence was carved into the space between us, burned into the notepad resting on my lap. A mortuary, long abandoned, its license revoked years ago after a string of disturbing allegations. Missing bodies, improperly handled remains, whispers of something worse that never quite made it to trial. A place that had been left to rot in the city's forgotten corners, waiting for someone like Mercer to claim it as his own. We turned onto a narrow street lined with sagging fences and boarded-up windows, the kind of place where even the streetlights had given up, their broken bulbs hanging lifelessly from rusted poles. The mortuary loomed at the end of the block, a two-story structure with a slanted roof and darkened windows, its brick exterior worn and cracked with age. A single security light flickered above the entrance, casting pale, shuddering beams onto the sidewalk. The building wasn't abandoned. Not really. Calloway killed the engine, and for a moment the silence was thick enough to suffocate. The kind of silence that wasn't truly empty, the kind that held something unseen beneath it. I reached for my gun, checking the chamber, out of habit more than necessity, because I already knew that whatever was inside that building, a bullet wasn't going to be enough to make it right. We moved toward the entrance together, slow and deliberate, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the night. The door was locked, but the key in my pocket was already there, already waiting, already fitting too perfectly into the rusted lock. The mechanism turned with a reluctant click, and then the door drifted open, revealing the yawning darkness beyond. The first breath I took inside tasted stale, thick with the weight of decay and old chemicals, the ghost of something acrid still lingering in the air. The walls were lined with empty shelves, dust-covered jars, rusted surgical tools left behind like relics of another time. The mortuary had been stripped of its official purpose, but not its function. The table in the center of the room, once meant for preparation, was still there, its surface wiped clean but still scarred from years of use. And then there was the smell. Not just the chemical sterility of the past, but something fresher, something deeper, something that made the back of my throat tighten in instinctive revulsion. It was the smell of something that had been kept too long, something that had once been human but had since become something else. Calloway was the first to notice the door in the back, slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it stretching into something deeper. He glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes, but we both already knew the answer. We stepped forward together, pushing it open, revealing the narrow hallway beyond. The walls were lined with plastic sheeting, carefully draped, meticulously placed. The sound of our footsteps changed here, the floor beneath us covered in something softer, something meant to catch what the walls could not. And at the end of the hall, another door, this one locked with something newer, something deliberate, a padlock freshly installed, its surface unmarred by time. We didn't hesitate. Calloway raised his gun, and with a single decisive motion, the butt of it came crashing down against the lock, breaking it free with a sharp metallic snap. The door swung open, and what waited on the other side was something neither of us were ready for. The room was small, windowless, its walls lined with more plastic sheeting. But it wasn't the space itself that made my breath hitch. It was the asterisks, Two bodies, seated like mannequins, their skin smooth, their features preserved in a way that was both perfect and horribly wrong. Their eyes were open, unseeing, their lips parted as if frozen mid-sentence. Their hands were positioned carefully, fingers intertwined in a silent companionship that had never been theirs in life. And then, in the corner of the room, something moved. It wasn't Mercer. It was her. She was alive. The girl, no, the woman curled into herself, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her wrists bound in front of her with a length of twine so thin it had already begun to cut into the flesh beneath. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, darting between us and the figures beside her, as if she wasn't sure whether we were real or just another part of whatever nightmare she had been trapped in. I moved first, crouching in front of her, hands raised in something close to surrender, my voice low, careful. "You're safe now. We're here to get you out." But even as I said the words, even as Calloway moved to cut the bindings from her wrists, the feeling that had been clawing at the back of my mind since we arrived finally took shape. Mercer wasn't here. This wasn't his final stage. It was just another step in the process. And somewhere, out there in the city, he was still working, still creating, still waiting. The woman barely moved when Calloway cut the bindings from her wrists, her skin raw where the twine had bitten deep, the red lines standing out starkly against her pale flesh. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, just sat there with her arms limp in her lap, eyes darting between us and the figures beside her, as if she wasn't sure which of us were real. She had been here too long. Long enough for the walls of this place to press into her mind, to make her question whether she was still part of the world outside or just another piece of Elias Mercer's carefully arranged collection. I spoke softly, careful not to startle her, even though every muscle in my body was tense, every instinct screaming that we were still too close to something unfinished. "Can you tell me your name?" The words barely made it past my throat, because the truth was, I already knew who she was. The missing posters, the grainy security footage, the desperate pleas from her family that had circulated for weeks. Ava Monroe, 23, art student, a life that had been carefully unraveling ever since the moment Elias Mercer chose her. She swallowed, her breath coming shallow and uneven, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite make the words come. Then finally a whisper. "He's not done." The weight of those 3 words sent something cold down my spine, something that made the edges of the room seem closer than they had been a moment before. I glanced at Calloway, saw the tension in his jaw, the way his grip on his gun tightened just slightly. He had heard it too, and he understood just as well as I did. Elias Mercer wasn't just collecting his victims. He was working on something bigger, something incomplete, and we had just stepped into the middle of it. Ava's gaze flickered past me toward the open doorway, her body going rigid all at once. I didn't need to ask what she had heard. I had already caught the sound myself. A shift in the silence, the almost imperceptible creak of weight settling on an old wooden floor. Not from this room, not from the hallway we had come through, but from somewhere deeper in the building. Calloway was already moving, stepping toward the door, his gun raised, his movements slow but deliberate. I reached for my radio, my voice barely above a breath. "Dispatch, this is Holt. We need immediate backup at 1337 Holloway Street. We have a live victim and possible suspects still on site." The response crackled back almost instantly, confirmation that units were en route. But it didn't change the fact that we were here now, that the walls of this place were closing in with something unseen still lurking inside them. Ava's hand suddenly gripped my sleeve, her fingers ice cold, her voice hoarse. "You don't understand," she whispered, her breath shaking, her eyes flicking toward the doorway again. "He's been watching. He always knows." And then the lights went out. It wasn't gradual. There was no flicker, no warning, just an abrupt, suffocating blackness that swallowed the room whole, snuffing out the dim glow from the street lamp outside, plunging us into something absolute. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I stood frozen for half a second, listening, straining for any sound beyond our own breathing. Then I heard it, a whisper, so soft it barely brushed the edges of my awareness. Not words, not anything I could fully grasp, but something just beyond reach carried through the dark like a breath against the back of my neck. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving somewhere beyond the doorway, just out of reach, just far enough to make it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Calloway's voice was low but edged with something sharp. "He's still in here." I already knew that. The darkness was his. The silence belonged to him. This wasn't just some abandoned mortuary he had claimed as his workspace. This was a place he had spent time in, learned, shaped into something that obeyed his will. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on, the beam cutting through the blackness in sharp angles, casting two long shadows against the plastic-lined walls. The door leading back into the main hallway stood open, a hollow rectangle of deeper darkness. Beyond it, something shifted. A sound, something soft, something dragging. Then a whisper, this time real words just barely carried by the still air. "You shouldn't be here." My blood turned cold. It wasn't Elias Mercer's voice. It was a woman's, and it was coming from somewhere inside the walls. Calloway moved first, his flashlight sweeping across the room as we stepped into the hallway. Ava pressing close behind me, her breath uneven but silent. The walls here felt too close, the air too thick, the plastic sheeting shifting just slightly, as if something beyond them had been disturbed. I reached out, fingers brushing against the plastic, feeling the cold surface press against my skin, and then behind it, a hollow space. I exhaled sharply. "There's something behind this wall." Calloway's light flickered toward the floor, catching the edge of something just beneath the sheeting. A seam, a hidden door, a space built into the structure of the building itself. And from within it, something knocked. Once, then twice. Ava whimpered behind me, barely suppressing a sob. Then a voice. Weak, fragile. Another survivor. "Help me," it whispered. "Please." And just like that, I understood. This wasn't just a crime scene. It wasn't just a place where bodies were arranged, or lives were ended in the name of something twisted. This was a holding space, a place where the unfinished work waited, which meant Elias Mercer wasn't just in this building. He was coming back. The knocking was soft, almost rhythmic, as if whoever was behind that wall didn't have the strength to make it louder. 3 slow taps, then silence. A pause, then 3 more. Not frantic, not desperate, just patient, just waiting. The kind of sound that crawls under your skin because it shouldn't be happening at all. Calloway's flashlight beam was shaking just slightly as it passed over the plastic sheeting again, catching the seam of the hidden door, a subtle indentation in the wall that had been carefully disguised. His voice was low, barely more than breath. "We're not alone in here." Ava let out a tiny whimper behind me, so soft it was barely a sound, but I could feel her fingers trembling where they clutched my sleeve. Her entire body wound so tight she might have collapsed if she let go. She wasn't just afraid of what was behind that wall. She was afraid because she knew what it was. She had heard that knocking before. I reached out slowly, my fingertips brushing the seam, feeling the edge of the door hidden beneath the plastic. The air was colder here, stagnant. My pulse was a slow, heavy drumbeat in my ears. "We're going to get you out," I said, forcing my voice to stay even, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the person behind the wall or to myself. The knocking stopped. For a long, breathless moment, the silence stretched. The walls around us seemed to press in tighter, the weight of this place settling into my ribs like something alive. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it all, a whisper seeped through the cracks. Faint, almost not there at all, but the words were unmistakable. "He's here!" Ava sucked in a sharp breath. Calloway's gun snapped up instinctively, his stance shifting. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the plastic-draped hallway, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the silence of an empty building. But I knew better. Elias Mercer didn't need sound. He didn't need movement, because he had already been watching. Calloway shifted, muttering under his breath as he reached for his radio, The static from the receiver suddenly too loud in the quiet. "This is Calloway. Suspect is confirmed on site. We need backup now." A flicker of movement, a shadow just past the doorway at the end of the hall. And then the lights came back on, not all at once. A slow, deliberate flicker. One bulb humming to life, then another, casting pale yellow light down the length of the hallway, illuminating the plastic-covered walls. The stains on the concrete floor, the old rusted tools left forgotten in the corners. The sudden brightness was almost worse than the darkness, because now there was nowhere to hide. Nothing standing between us and whatever had been lurking just beyond reach. A creak in the floorboards, not far, just down the hall. I turned my head slowly, following the sound. My pulse a slow, heavy drumbeat in my throat. And then I saw him. He was standing just at the edge of the light, half hidden by the shadows, his head tilted slightly as if studying us, as if amused. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the air in the room, to press into the space between us like something tangible. He was tall, lean, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his dark hair slicked back in a way that made him look more like a wax figure than a man. His eyes, deep-set and unreadable, swept over us slowly, calculating. And then, finally, his gaze landed on me, and he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk. Something colder, something knowing. A slow, deliberate curve of the lips that sent a sickening weight into the pit of my stomach. Elias Mercer had been waiting for us. Calloway's gun was already up, his stance shifting, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Don't move!" Mercer didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't do anything at all. Just watched. Then finally he blinked, tilting his head a fraction more, his smile widening just slightly. "She's not ready yet," he said, his voice soft, almost polite. Ava made a sound somewhere between a sob and a breath, her fingers digging deeper into my sleeve. My mouth had gone dry. Calloway took a step forward, gun still locked on him. "Get on the ground, hands where I can see them." Mercer let out a slow breath, as if disappointed. Then, so casually it made my skin crawl, he lifted his hands, palms open, surrendering without argument. But I knew this wasn't surrender. Elias Mercer wasn't done. Not with us, not with Ava, not with whoever was still behind that wall. And as we stepped forward, as Calloway moved to cuff him, that sickening smile never left his face. Because he had already won something. I just didn't know what it was yet. Elias Mercer never stopped smiling, not even as Calloway wrenched his arms behind his back. Not even as the cold bite of steel closed around his wrists with the sharp mechanical snap of handcuffs locking into place. He didn't fight, didn't resist, didn't so much as flinch. His breath was steady, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed, as if this was all just part of some carefully orchestrated performance, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. I should have felt relief, should have let the tension in my shoulders ease, should have believed at least for a moment that it was over. But I couldn't, because the air in that mortuary was still thick with something unfinished, something lingering just beneath the surface, something unseen but still there. Ava hadn't moved. She stood frozen at my side, her breath coming shallow and fast, her eyes locked on Mercer as if looking away from him for even a second would allow him to disappear and reappear somewhere closer, somewhere inside her skin. The terror in her was something primal, something that went deeper than just fear of what had already happened. She was afraid of what was still coming. And then the knocking started again. A single weak tap from inside the hidden room, a barely there sound, almost lost beneath the weight of the moment. Then another, and another. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. The pattern was identical to before, patient, waiting. But this time I knew for certain what it meant. Someone else was still in there. I turned away from Mercer, my pulse a steady, insistent pounding in my ears, as I grabbed the edge of the plastic sheeting and ripped it back, exposing the seam of the hidden door. Up close, I could see the way it had been designed to blend seamlessly with the wall, the hinges carefully concealed, the edges smoothed over with layers of paint and plaster. This wasn't something hastily thrown together. This had been part of the plan from the beginning. I reached for the latch, fingers curling around cold metal, my breath catching as I hesitated for half a second. Then, before I could think too hard about what I might find on the other side, I pulled. The door swung open into darkness, stale air rushing out in a breath that smelled of sweat, of fear, of something older, something deeper. The flashlight beam cut through the black, sweeping over the small, windowless space beyond, revealing a narrow cot pushed against the wall, a thin, rumpled blanket tangled in the corner, a bucket, a plastic water bottle, half empty, and then, hunched in the farthest corner, arms wrapped around trembling legs, a girl. She flinched as the light hit her, a sharp intake of breath rasping through her throat, her eyes squeezed shut as if expecting pain, as if expecting him. She was young, barely out of her teens, hollow-cheeked and pale, her lips cracked, her wrists bruised from where they had been bound, her body small enough that she barely looked real. And yet she was breathing. She was alive. I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice, making it as gentle as I could, even as my heart was slamming against my ribs. "It's okay. You're safe now. We're here to help you." She didn't answer right away, just stayed curled into herself, motionless, her breath shaking. Then finally, in a voice so soft it barely existed, she whispered, "He told me I was going to be his masterpiece." A sharp, cold nausea twisted in my stomach, a slow wave of realization crashing over me all at once. Ava made a choked sound behind me, her fingers clutching at my sleeve, her body shaking so hard I could feel it. Masterpiece. Not just another victim, not just another carefully arranged display. Something more. The final piece of whatever Elias Mercer had been building, the culmination of everything. I turned my head, looking back toward him, where Calloway was still holding him in place, gun trained at the center of his chest, waiting for the other officers to arrive. Mercer's eyes met mine across the room, his expression unreadable, his head tilted just slightly, studying me the same way he had when I first saw the sketches of the victims, the same way he had when I found the drawing of myself at the end of that sketchbook. I had the sinking, sickening feeling that he had wanted us to find her, that this wasn't a mistake, that we had arrived exactly when he had intended us to. And then he spoke, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. "You ruined it." The words settled in the air like something final, something irreversible. He didn't sound angry, didn't sound afraid, just disappointed, like an artist forced to abandon his life's work before it was complete. The sirens outside grew louder, flashing blue and red against the boarded-up windows, the distorted shapes of other officers moving through the darkened parking lot beyond. The world was closing in on him now, the walls pressing tighter, the stage collapsing beneath him. But Mercer only stood there, still smiling. And that was when I realized he wasn't afraid, not of prison, not of being caught, not of any of it, because Elias Mercer hadn't lost. His final piece was unfinished, his masterpiece incomplete, but it didn't matter, because his work wasn't about the art itself. It was about the idea of it, the fear it created, the stories it would leave behind, the people who would never stop thinking about him, who would carry his existence in their minds long after the case was closed, long after he was locked away. He would still be there, waiting in the spaces between thoughts, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the shadows of places that should be empty. And that was the real horror, not the bodies, not the crime scenes, not even the things he had done. It was the knowing that someone like him existed, the knowing that he could never truly be erased, the knowing that somewhere in some darkened room, another pair of eyes might already be watching, another set of hands might already be sketching. And that was why, long after they took him away, long after the flashing lights faded and the walls of that mortuary stood empty, I could still feel him there, still waiting, still watching. "You must be hungry." I know I was. That's how it all started. A hunger, not just for food, but for truth. The kind of hunger that gnaws at you late at night when you know there's something rotten beneath the surface, something people pretend isn't there, something you can almost smell if you breathe in deep enough. And Tokyo, for all its neon lights and gleaming skyscrapers, had a stench lurking beneath the perfume of grilled yakitori and fresh ramen broth, a stench that no one wanted to acknowledge. My name is Taro Watanabe. I was 36, a journalist, and I thought I had seen the worst of humanity. I had reported on murders, corruption, and crimes that left a pit in my stomach, but nothing prepared me for what I would find inside that restaurant. It began with a whisper. A rumor passed between chefs in the back alleys of Shinjuku, shared over cheap cigarettes and stolen glances. An underground dining experience, known only to the elite, a place where money could buy you a meal so exclusive, so forbidden, that few even dared to speak its name. There was no website, no advertisements, no way in unless you were invited. They called it Shinsei, meaning new life. I heard it first from a sous chef who had too much to drink. He spoke in a hushed voice, his fingers trembling around his glass. It's not normal, Watanabe-san. The things they serve, it's not just food. It's something else. I pressed him for details, but he refused to say more. Just shook his head and muttered, "People disappear." That was all I needed. For weeks I searched. I spoke to restaurant critics, black market dealers, anyone who might have heard of this hidden place. The deeper I dug, the stranger the stories became. An American businessman who vanished after bragging about an upcoming reservation. A homeless woman last seen near a high-end kitchen supply store where a well-dressed man had been offering her a job. The pieces were scattered, but they all led back to one man, Renji Takahashi. The name carried weight in the culinary world. A Michelin-starred chef, a visionary in Japanese-French fusion cuisine. The kind of man whose dishes were auctioned off like rare art. But there was something unsettling about him. His restaurants changed locations frequently. His menus were never the same, and those who dined with him often spoke of the experience with an odd hesitation, as if they were unsure whether they had enjoyed it or survived it. Then finally an opportunity. An envelope arrived at my apartment, slipped under my door in the middle of the night. Thick, high-quality paper, my name written in precise calligraphy. Inside was a single card, black with embossed gold lettering. Shinsei invites you. A date, a time, and an address that didn't exist on any map. I should have gone to the police. I should have told someone where I was going. But I didn't, because I was hungry, and hunger makes fools of us all. The address led me to a quiet, unmarked building in an upscale district of Tokyo. No sign, no windows, just a single steel door. A well-dressed man in a tailored black suit stood outside, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He regarded me with a polite but impassive expression before stepping aside to let me in. The interior was nothing like a typical restaurant. No noise, no clatter of dishes or hurried footsteps of waitstaff. The walls were deep mahogany, the floors polished to a mirror-like shine. A faint scent of something rich and savory lingered in the air, mixed with an undertone of something else, something metallic. A hostess in a flowing silk kimono led me down a dimly lit corridor, her footsteps soundless on the thick carpet. She did not ask for my name. She already knew it. Inside the main dining room, there were no more than 10 guests, all seated at a long, elegantly set table. Crystal glasses, antique silverware, candles flickering in the low light. They were all wealthy, powerful, the kind of people whose names appeared in business magazines and political headlines. They barely glanced at me as I took my seat. Renji Takahashi entered without announcement. He was older than I expected, silver hair neatly combed back, his face lined but dignified. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who knew he was in control. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Tonight you will taste something truly unforgettable." The first course arrived, delicate and beautifully plated. A sliver of meat, marbled and glistening with a rich sauce. The guests ate without hesitation, murmuring appreciation. I hesitated, my fork hovering above my plate. Takahashi watched me. "You must be hungry, Watanabe-san," he said, his eyes gleaming. Please, eat. I lifted the fork to my mouth, my pulse hammering. The meat was tender, melting against my tongue with a complexity of flavors I could not place. Rich, almost too rich. And then, just beneath the surface, a taste that sent ice down my spine. Something was wrong. Takahashi tilted his head, amused. You recognize it, don't you? He murmured. The guests continued eating, their knives gliding through their meals without pause. A woman beside me licked her lips, savoring every bite. My stomach clenched. My hands trembled. I knew that taste. I had reported on it before, long ago, when covering forensic cases. The scent, the texture, the unmistakable umami that no ordinary meat could possess. I pushed the plate away. Takahashi's smile widened. You see, Watanabe-san, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. Hunger is the oldest instinct, the purest. And once you understand that, you will know there is no greater indulgence than the taste of regret. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every pair of eyes at the table turned to me, the candlelight reflecting in their pupils. The door behind me was closed. The corridor I had walked through now seemed impossibly long. Takahashi set down his glass, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, rhythmic pattern. You must be hungry, he said again, softer this time. And then the doors locked. I had always believed that the worst kind of fear was the one that struck suddenly, the kind that hit like a gunshot in the dark, sharp and all-consuming. But I was wrong. True fear, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there, does not announce itself with violence. It seeps in slowly, creeping along your spine in cold, delicate fingers, taking its time to settle into the deepest parts of you. That was the fear I felt as I stood in that silent dining room, the weight of every gaze pressing down on me, the locked doors behind me transforming the air into something thick and suffocating. The taste lingered on my tongue, an aftertaste that refused to fade no matter how hard I swallowed. My stomach churned, not from the richness of the dish, but from the unbearable knowledge of what I had just consumed. I could still feel the texture of it against my teeth, still recall the moment my tongue had registered the truth, and I fought the urge to retch right there at the table. Renji Takahashi watched me with that same measured amusement, his silver hair catching the candlelight, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles against the rim of his wine glass. There was no malice in his expression, no overt threat, and that was what made it worse. He was patient, waiting, knowing that I had already reached the only conclusion there was to reach. You don't have to be afraid, Watanabe-san, he said finally, his voice a gentle hum, soothing in a way that made my skin crawl. You are among friends here. The other guests continued their meal as if nothing had changed, their knives and forks scraping against their plates in unhurried, rhythmic movements. A woman in an emerald green dress lifted a slice of seared meat to her lips, chewing slowly, her eyes half-lidded in pleasure. A man in an expensive three-piece suit reached for his wine, swirling it lazily before taking a sip, nodding in appreciation. None of them looked at me. None of them acknowledged the tension that was thick enough to choke on. I forced my voice to remain steady, though my hands had already curled into fists beneath the table. I don't know what this is, I said, though I knew exactly what it was. But I have no interest in being a part of it. Takahashi sighed, setting his glass down with a soft clink against the table. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp, elegant features now only inches from mine. I could see the faint wrinkles at the corners of his mouth, the lines that deepened when he smiled. And it struck me then how many times he must have done this before, how many had sat in my very seat, tasting what they were never meant to taste. Watanabe-san, he murmured, his voice almost pitying, you already are. The realization sank in like a stone. The invitation, the secrecy, the way my name had been known before I ever spoke it. I had been chosen, and choices once made were not so easily undone. I pushed back from the table, the legs of my chair dragging against the polished floor with a sound that made some of the other guests pause. Not all of them, just a few, as if mildly inconvenienced by my reaction, but not particularly surprised. A man across from me let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as he cut into his food. The doors. I turned, striding toward them, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands already reaching for the polished brass handles. They were heavier than I expected, cold and unmoving beneath my grip. I pulled. Nothing. I twisted, shoved, braced my shoulder against the wood, but the door did not so much as creak. Behind me, someone sighed in quiet amusement. Please. Takahashi's voice floated toward me, still calm, still unbothered. There is no need for dramatics. You are our guest, and I assure you, no harm will come to you. I turned back slowly, my breath unsteady, my mind racing. The room remained unchanged, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows across the walls, the guests continuing their meal as if nothing about this was unusual. And perhaps for them, it wasn't. Perhaps this was routine. My pulse roared in my ears. You can't keep me here, I said, though I was no longer certain of that. Takahashi tilted his head slightly, considering me. Then, with a small smile, he gestured toward the table. Sit, he said, the command wrapped in velvet. Finish your meal. I shook my head. I'm leaving. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something like disappointment. He took his napkin, dabbing at the corners of his mouth before setting it aside with delicate precision. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but it carried the weight of something final. Watanabe-san, he said, if you were leaving, you would have already gone. A chill spread through me. He was right. The doors were locked. The guests were unbothered. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of this place, someone was preparing the next course. I took a slow step back, my mouth dry, my mind screaming for a way out, a crack in the polished surface of this nightmare. But there was none. Only the weight of the air, the sound of slow chewing, the scent of something rich and terrible filling my lungs. Takahashi's gaze did not waver. Sit, he said again. And this time I did. I sat because there was no other choice. Not really. The air in the room had changed, thickened somehow, pressing in from all sides, heavy with the unspoken knowledge that the doors behind me were not the kind that opened for people who wanted to leave. My pulse was a steady hammer in my ears, a frantic, uneven rhythm that clashed with the slow, deliberate movements of the other diners, their forks and knives scraping softly against porcelain as they ate without hesitation. Their silence was the worst part of it. Not one of them acknowledged what was happening. Not one of them reacted to my attempt to leave. My rising fear, the weight of it curling around my throat like an unseen hand. They just kept eating. Takahashi was still watching me, his expression unreadable, his silver hair smooth and untouched as if not even a moment of tension had ruffled him. He was patient, waiting for me to understand what he already knew. I was not in control here. A waiter, silent and efficient, approached from the shadows beyond the candlelight, moving without sound. He carried another plate, identical to the one before, the same delicate cut of seared meat resting in the center, a drizzle of deep red sauce pooling around it like blood on silk. He placed it in front of me without a word, then stepped back, hands folded neatly, eyes cast downward. I could see the tendons in his neck, the careful way he held his shoulders, the kind of posture that came from years of knowing one misstep could cost more than just a job. Takahashi reached for his glass of wine, swirling the deep crimson liquid before taking a slow sip. Then he set it down with the same deliberate grace he did everything else, and spoke in that same smooth, measured voice. There are rules, Watanabe-san, he said, his fingers tapping once against the table. A barely audible sound, but one that sent a ripple of something cold through my spine. Rules that must be followed if one is to dine here. The woman in the emerald dress smiled faintly, as if enjoying an inside joke. Across the table, a man dabbed at his lips with his napkin, adjusting his cufflinks with a slow, unhurried motion. They all knew the rules. They had followed them before. I forced myself to speak, though my throat was tight, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. And what happens if I refuse? Takahashi exhaled softly, not quite a sigh, more like the kind of sound one makes when explaining something to a stubborn child. He lifted his hand, a slight gesture, and the waiter, still standing just within the shadows, took a step back. Refusal is a choice, he said, tilting his head slightly, but all choices have consequences. Something in the way he said it, something in the almost gentle cadence of his voice, made the room seem smaller. The candlelight flickered, shifting the shadows, and for a moment I swore I saw movement beyond the edges of my vision, something deeper in the restaurant. Past the walls of this dining room, waiting. The food sat in front of me, untouched. My stomach churned. My skin felt too tight. Takahashi watched, waiting. I thought of the stories, the rumors, the missing people. I thought of the taste that still clung to my tongue. My hands clenched beneath the table. I didn't come here for this. Takahashi's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. And yet, here you are. A silence stretched between us, the kind that made the air feel thick, almost unbreathable. I could feel every set of eyes on me, the weight of them pressing in from all sides. The diners who did not speak, the waiter who did not move, the unseen presence beyond the candlelight, beyond the locked doors, waiting for whatever came next. Takahashi's fingers tapped against the table again, a slow, deliberate rhythm, and somewhere in the distance I heard something shift, a faint metallic sound, the creak of a hinge, the whisper of fabric moving against tile. Something was happening. The woman in the emerald dress tilted her head slightly, her expression curious, as if she was waiting to see what I would do. Takahashi gestured toward my plate, a simple motion, an invitation or a command. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. "Eat, Watanabe-san," he said, voice like silk against steel. "Or be eaten." The words settled in the air like smoke, curling into the spaces between the candlelight, sinking into the marrow of my bones. And in the silence that followed, I realized something. I wasn't just a guest here. I was a part of the meal. I did not touch the food. I could not. The weight of what it was, of what I now understood it to be, had settled into my stomach like a sickness, spreading through my limbs, making my hands tremble beneath the table. My breathing felt too loud in the silence. My own heartbeat an unbearable sound, pounding against my ribs like a desperate fist against a locked door. I wanted to stand, to push away from the table again, to demand that they let me out. But something about the way Takahashi was watching me kept me frozen in place, my muscles tense, my body caught in a silent war between fight and flight. The others had finished their meals. Their plates were empty, wiped clean with the delicate edges of their utensils. The remnants of red sauce smeared in elegant swirls across porcelain. Wine glasses were being refilled, soft murmurs of conversation drifting between them, as if this were nothing more than an ordinary dinner party, as if nothing about this was wrong. The woman in the emerald dress leaned toward the man beside her, whispering something that made him chuckle, the sound low and indulgent, like someone amused by the naivety of a child. None of them looked at me, not directly, but I could feel their awareness, the way their gazes flickered toward me in brief, knowing glances, as if they had all sat in this seat before, as if they had all once been in my position and had learned over time the futility of resistance. Takahashi, still calm, still patient, reached for his wine again, taking a slow sip before speaking, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that made my skin crawl. "You misunderstand something, Watanabe-san," he said, setting the glass down with a faint click against the table. "This is not a punishment. It is a privilege." A privilege. I almost laughed, the sound bitter and dry in my throat. But I swallowed it back, my fingers curling into the fine linen napkin in my lap, twisting the fabric between my fists just to keep my hands from shaking. I forced my voice to stay steady. "A privilege," I repeated, my mouth dry, my lips numb around the word. "To eat what? To become what?" Takahashi smiled again, but there was something different in it now, something sharper at the edges. He did not answer immediately, instead tilting his head slightly, as if considering the question, as if deciding how much to tell me, how much I was ready to hear. Then he gestured, a small movement, effortless, and the waiter who had been standing in the shadows took a step forward. The man's posture remained stiff, his eyes still lowered, his expression a careful mask of obedience. But now that I was paying attention, I saw the way his fingers twitched slightly at his sides, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. the way the candlelight caught the thin sheen of sweat along his hairline. He was afraid, not of me, of something else, of what was coming next. Takahashi's voice was smooth, gentle, almost soothing. Would you like to see where the food comes from? The table fell silent. Even the quiet murmurs of conversation had stopped. The clinking of glasses, the occasional laughter, all of it extinguished at once, as if everyone was waiting, listening, waiting to see if I would say yes, if I would make the choice they had all made before. I wanted to say no. I wanted to refuse, to push away from this table, to demand that they open the doors and let me go. But I already knew they wouldn't. I already knew that whatever I said, whatever I did, I would not be leaving this place until they decided I could. And so I did the only thing I could. I nodded. Takahashi's smile widened, and something flickered behind his eyes, a glint of satisfaction, of amusement, of something else I could not name. He rose from his seat in a single smooth motion, folding his napkin neatly before placing it beside his plate. Then he turned, gesturing for me to follow. The waiter hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward again, moving toward a door at the far end of the room, a door that had been invisible until now, blending seamlessly into the dark wood paneling, hidden in plain sight. He reached for the handle, his fingers tightening around the polished brass. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw him close his eyes, his lips parting slightly, as if whispering something under his breath, a prayer. Then he opened the door, and I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, not the rich, intoxicating aroma of the dishes served in the dining room, not the delicate spices or the slow-simmered sauces, not the perfume of carefully plated indulgence. This was different. This was raw, metallic, thick in the air like humidity on the skin. A smell I recognized instantly, a smell I had only encountered at crime scenes, in morgues, in the unventilated rooms of abandoned buildings where the dead had been left too long. Blood. The walls were a deep, polished black, the overhead lighting a cold, sterile white that cast everything in stark contrast. Stainless steel countertops gleamed beneath it, rows of sharp knives lining magnetic strips along the walls, the gleam of their edges catching the light. The floors were wet, the faint reflection of overhead bulbs rippling against the sheen of something dark that had been washed down the drains too recently, too hurriedly. And then, the tables. At first, they looked like ordinary butcher's tables, the kind you would find in any high-end kitchen, sturdy, functional, their surfaces scratched from years of careful preparation. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw the straps along the edges, the faint indentations in the wood, the deep, uneven grooves where something or someone had struggled. I did not move. I did not breathe. Takahashi stepped past me, walking with the same effortless grace he always had, his hands tucked behind his back, his expression serene, as if this were nothing more than another kitchen, another workspace, another necessary part of the art he had created. He reached one of the tables, running his fingers along the surface, pausing for only a moment before looking back at me, his head tilting slightly as if waiting to see my reaction. And then, behind me, something moved. A sound, a breath. Not mine. I turned slowly, the cold weight of inevitability already pressing down on my shoulders, and saw what I had been trying so desperately not to see. The meat had to come from somewhere, and some of it was still alive. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that the fear had finally sunk its claws deep enough to distort reality. But the sound came again, low and strained, the unmistakable rasp of breath forced through weak lungs. It came from the far side of the kitchen, from behind the long steel counter where the overhead light did not quite reach, from a place the others at the table had never seen, a place they had chosen not to see. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to pretend I had not heard it, to pretend that the knowledge of what lay beyond that shadowed space had not already settled into my bones. But Takahashi was watching, waiting, patient as always. And I knew that I could not leave this room without facing it. So I stepped forward. The floor beneath my shoes was damp. The smell of iron so thick in the air now that I could taste it, feel it settling against my tongue like the memory of something I could never swallow away. The sound grew louder as I moved closer, breath hitching, uneven, wet with something I did not want to name. And then, as I reached the end of the counter, I saw them. There were two, a man and a woman, both stripped to their underclothes, their skin pale beneath the harsh, fluorescent light, their bodies draped over metal racks like animals waiting to be butchered. Their wrists and ankles were bound with thick leather straps, their limbs stretched too far, their joints unnaturally strained. The woman's head lolled forward, dark hair matted against her face, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow movements. The man, older, thinner, had his eyes open, dull and unfocused, barely conscious but still aware enough to see me standing there. To register the expression on my face, I felt bile rise in my throat. Takahashi's voice came from behind me, smooth and unhurried, like he was explaining something simple, something that should have been obvious all along. "Every meal must be prepared with care," he said, stepping forward, his presence suddenly too close, his warmth unsettling against the cold sterility of the kitchen. "The finest ingredients require time, patience, a rushed hand, an untrained touch, and the balance is lost. And balance, Watanabe-san, is everything." The man on the rack blinked, his lips parting slightly, a sound escaping him that was not quite a word, not quite a plea, just the fragile remnants of what little strength remained in him. He was looking at me now, not at Takahashi, not at the kitchen around us, but directly at me, his gaze locking onto mine with something raw, something desperate. I felt my breath stutter. "Please," the man rasped, one word. And then from beside him, the woman shifted, her body trembling with the effort, her fingers twitching against the straps that bound her wrists. Her head lifted just slightly, just enough for me to see her eyes beneath the curtain of her hair. And they were not empty. They were not resigned. They were pleading. I turned sharply, facing Takahashi, my voice coming out harsher than I intended, my control slipping. "You call this balance?" I demanded, the words sharp, cutting. "You call this—" I gestured toward the bound bodies, toward the blood-stained floors, toward the plates that had been wiped clean by the people in the other room, people who had known exactly what they were eating and had done nothing but raise their glasses in silent approval. "This is murder." Takahashi regarded me with the same amused patience he always had, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over something he had long since accepted as truth. He stepped closer, folding his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. "It is necessity," he said simply. "It is evolution." His voice remained calm, controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something that sent a chill down my spine, a certainty, a finality. I realized then that there was no arguing with him. There was no breaking through the carefully constructed philosophy he had wrapped around this place. No forcing him to see the horror for what it was, because he already saw it. He saw it and he accepted it. He embraced it, and worse, so did they. The guests, the staff, they were all complicit. The weight of it crashed over me, the sheer impossibility of escape pressing in from all sides. I could not run. The doors were locked. I could not fight. There were too many of them. And even if I found a way out, what then? The people who dined here were powerful, the kind of people who made others disappear without a trace, who erased problems with the stroke of a pen or the whisper of a name in the right ears. I was already gone, unless. I swallowed, my mind racing, forcing my voice to steady. "And what happens now?" Takahashi studied me for a long moment, as if weighing something, as if determining whether I was worth an answer at all. Then finally he smiled. "That," he said, "is up to you." The words settled like a knife between my ribs. I understood. There were only two ways to leave this place, as one of them, or as a meal. I turned, my gaze falling once more on the bound bodies before me, on the raw, quiet fear in their eyes, the silent plea that hung in the air between us. They had no choice, but I did. My hands curled into fists. Slowly, I reached for the nearest knife, its edge glinting beneath the cold white light, the steel cool against my fingers. The weight of it was solid, real, grounding me in a way nothing else could. Takahashi watched. I turned, the blade held firm in my grip. my own breath steady now, my own choice finally clear. And then, with one swift motion, I cut the straps. The woman fell first, her body crumpling against the table with a sharp gasp, and the sound shattered the silence, sent a ripple of something sharp and electric through the room. The man followed, slumping forward, weak but alive, still alive, and that was all that mattered. Takahashi did not move. He did not shout or reach for a weapon. He only sighed, shaking his head slightly, almost disappointed. Almost. Then behind him, the door to the dining room opened. The guests had heard the commotion, and they were coming. I grabbed the woman's arm, pulling her to her feet, ignoring the way she stumbled, the way her legs struggled to hold her weight. The man groaned, trying to move, and I reached for him too, the adrenaline surging now, burning away every other thought except one. Run! I did not look back. The last thing I heard as we stumbled through the kitchen doors, as we pushed into the unknown, was Takahashi's voice, soft, almost amused, calling after me through the chaos. There is no greater indulgence, he said, than the taste of regret. And then the doors closed behind us, and we were running, and the hunt had begun. You are listening, aren't you? You can hear my voice, steady now, but it wasn't always like this. There was a time when my breath came in short, sharp bursts, when my heart pounded so hard I thought it would crack my ribs from the inside. A time when I stood alone in the middle of a forest, staring at something I couldn't explain, something I shouldn't have found. If I close my eyes, I can still see it, still hear it, the wind moving through the trees, the slow creak of branches swaying overhead, the damp earth shifting beneath my feet, and the whisper. That sound soft and curling at the edges, just beneath the wind. But that part came later. I was just hiking. That's all it was supposed to be. A Saturday afternoon, the air still thick with the last traces of summer, the scent of pine needles and damp soil filling my lungs as I moved deeper into Blackwood Forest. I had been coming here for years, knew the trails like the back of my hand, could close my eyes and picture every twist and turn, every fallen log and sunlit clearing. There was nothing strange about that day, not at first. The trees stood tall and dark around me, their canopies shifting with the wind, golden light filtering through in patches that dappled the ground in flickering shapes. I could hear birds calling in the distance, the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, normal, until I found them. It wasn't the smell that led me there. It wasn't the sound. It was something else, something deeper, something I can't quite explain. A feeling in my chest, a pull towards something just beyond the trees, just out of sight. And when I stepped off the trail, moving carefully between the thick trunks, my boots pressing into soft earth, that was when I saw them. A row of freshly dug graves. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The soil was uneven, darker than the earth around it, the edges rough and jagged, as if someone had worked hastily, desperately. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was the things resting on top of the disturbed dirt, carefully placed, positioned with an attention to detail that sent a slow, crawling unease up my spine. A silver bracelet, a red scarf, a pair of reading glasses, their frame cracked on one side. Objects that didn't belong in the forest, that didn't belong here. My breath caught in my throat as I took a slow step closer, my mind trying to piece together something logical, something that made sense. Maybe someone buried a pet. Maybe it was some kind of strange memorial. But I already knew deep down that wasn't the case. Because then I saw the shoe, small, white, a streak of mud across the toe, half buried in the dirt, the laces tucked neatly inside, and I ran. I don't remember making the decision to move, don't remember turning back toward the trail, but suddenly my legs were carrying me forward, my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. The trees blurred past me, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The silence had changed. The birds had stopped calling, the wind had stilled, and beneath it all, just at the edge of my hearing, I thought I heard something else. A voice, a whisper, my name. When I reached the trailhead, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone as I pulled it from my pocket, my fingers fumbling across the screen as I called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, asking me to slow down, to explain, but I couldn't find the words. How do you explain something like that? I gave them the location. I told them what I saw. And then I stood there alone, the forest stretching behind me, the weight of those graves pressing against my chest. I kept telling myself it was over, that I had done my part, that the police would handle it now. But as I stood there, waiting for the distant wail of sirens, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of those trees, that I wasn't alone. And then just beneath the wind, I heard it again. A whisper, so soft, so close. Laura. The police arrived faster than I expected. Within minutes, the stillness of Blackwood Forest was broken by the wail of sirens, the crunch of tires on gravel, the sharp bark of orders exchanged between officers as they moved toward the graves I had found. But even as they swept past me, their radios crackling, their voices clipped and professional, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I stood near my car at the trailhead, arms wrapped tightly around myself, my breath uneven despite the warmth of the afternoon sun pressing against my skin. I kept telling myself it was over now, that I had done what I was supposed to do, that the authorities were handling it. But deep down, I knew better. Because no matter how hard I tried to focus on the officers moving through the trees, on the measured voices discussing soil depth and search grids, my mind kept circling back to one thing, that asterisk voice. It had been right behind me, software close. My name stretched into something barely more than a breath, carried by the wind. But that wasn't possible. I had been alone out there. No one else had been in the trees with me. At least, no one I could see. I didn't realize I was shaking until I felt a hand on my shoulder, firm but gentle, grounding me. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. But it was just one of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice. Detective Erin Caldwell. She looked at me the way people do when they're trying to decide if you're about to break. "You found them?" she asked, her tone careful, measured as if speaking too harshly might make me shatter completely. I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. I was off the trail. I don't even know why I went that way. I had this feeling. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted just slightly. "And you didn't see anyone, hear anything?" My mouth felt dry. I wanted to say no, to shake my head, to pretend I hadn't heard the thing that was still echoing in my mind. But instead, before I could stop myself, I whispered, "I heard my name." Caldwell's gaze sharpened. "Someone called out to you?" I hesitated. "I don't know, it was strange. It didn't sound like someone calling from far away. It was more like a whisper, right next to me." She didn't react the way I expected. No skepticism, no barely concealed doubt. If anything, the way she inhaled just slightly, the way her fingers twitched against the notepad in her hand, told me she had heard something like this before. "Laura," she said after a moment, her voice quiet, almost careful, "did you hear anything like that before today?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated as if debating whether to tell me something, then exhaled slowly. Because the other women, before they disappeared, they all said the same thing, that they were hearing whispers, in their homes, in the woods, at work, always their names, always right behind them. The ground beneath me felt unsteady. The other women? The ones buried out there? Caldwell didn't answer right away. She just watched me, as if waiting to see how much weight I could handle before I broke beneath it. Then finally she nodded. "Every single one of them reported it," she said, "but there was never any proof, no recordings, no witnesses, just whispers in the dark. And then a few days later, they were gone." A cold nausea curled in my stomach, slow and creeping. I didn't want to ask the next question, but I had to. "How long?" I whispered, my voice barely more than breath. "Did they hear it before they disappeared?" Caldwell hesitated. Then she said, 3 days. The wind shifted through the trees, rattling the branches, making the forest behind us groan softly, like it was listening. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself, my breath uneven, my mind racing. 3 days, and today was day one. I barely noticed when Caldwell turned away, already giving orders, already moving back toward the scene. The other officers were still working, still searching, still piecing together the story buried beneath the soil. But I wasn't really there anymore. My body was, but my mind was somewhere else, trapped in the moment when I had first heard it. Had it really been the wind? Had it really been just my imagination? Or had something already marked me? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going home alone tonight. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Even as the last rays of daylight bled out behind the treetops, even as the crime scene tape fluttered in the cool evening air and the officers packed up their equipment, I knew that stepping back into my empty apartment would be a mistake. The thought of being alone, of turning off the lights and waiting in the silence, knowing that something might already be there, was unbearable. So I called my sister. Mia answered on the second ring, her voice groggy with sleep, despite the fact that it was barely past 9. She had always been an early riser, the kind of person who went to bed with the sun set and woke before the world had fully settled into morning. I envied that about her, the way she moved through life as if the darkness had never touched her. "Laura," she mumbled, voice thick with confusion. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. What was I supposed to say? That I had stumbled onto a row of unmarked graves? That I had heard something whisper my name where no one else should have been? That I was afraid, truly afraid, for the first time in my life? "I just didn't want to be alone tonight," I said finally, and it wasn't a lie. Mia was quiet for a moment, but then she exhaled, soft and knowing. "Come over," she said. "I'll make tea." The drive to her house was a blur of headlights and darkened streets, my pulse a steady drumbeat in my throat. Every red light felt too long. Every passing shadow in the corners of my vision made my skin prickle with unease. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I had spent too much time surrounded by death today, that the weight in my chest was just the aftermath of stumbling into something horrific. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel it. Something had changed. By the time I reached Mia's house, the sky had darkened to a deep, inky black, the stars barely visible through the thin cover of clouds. Her porch light was on, a small, warm glow against the darkness, and the sight of it sent a slow, shuddering relief through me. I climbed the steps 2 at a time, knocking twice before letting myself in. Mia was already waiting in the kitchen, 2 mugs of tea steaming on the counter. She looked me over as I walked in, her brow furrowing, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern in an instant. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic of the mug, letting the heat ground me. "I found something in the woods today," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Mia's eyes darkened. "Something bad?" I nodded. She didn't push. That was another thing I had always loved about her. She knew when to let me sit with my thoughts, when to give me space. We sat in silence for a while, the distant hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Then, just as I started to let myself relax, it happened again. A whisper. Software close, almost inside the house. I stiffened, my hands tightening around the mug. The air in the room shifted just slightly, the way it does when a storm is about to roll in, thick with pressure, with something unseen pressing against the edges of the space. Mia must have noticed because she frowned, tilting her head. "Laura!" I barely heard her. My mind was stuck on the sound, on the way it had curled around my name like a breath against the back of my neck. I turned my head slowly, my gaze flicking toward the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms. For a long, breathless moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mia said something that made my blood turn to ice. "Why did you whisper my name just now?" I looked at her, my stomach plummeting. "I didn't." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mia's face paled, her eyes widening just slightly as she glanced toward the hallway. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching too far, curling around the corners in ways that didn't make sense. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable, as if something unseen was pressing in around us, closing the distance between the walls, between the spaces we couldn't see. Mia swallowed, her voice quieter now. "It sounded like you," she whispered. I didn't know what to say, because I had heard it too, and it had sounded like her. The tea had gone cold in my hands. Neither of us moved for what felt like forever. The kitchen had become smaller, the space between us thick with something unseen, something waiting. Mia was still staring down the hallway, her fingers curled tightly around her mug, the color drained from her face. I wanted to tell her it was nothing, that maybe she had imagined it, that maybe I had imagined it too, but I couldn't, because I knew we hadn't. The whisper had been real. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. The house was quiet now, the silence pressing against us, stretching between the walls like something alive. I turned my head just slightly, listening, straining for any shift in the air, any creak of the floorboards, any sign that we weren't alone. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Mia exhaled shakily, setting her mug down with a small, uneven clink. Maybe it was, I don't know, the pipes? The wind? Her voice was thin, unconvincing, and I could see the way her hands trembled just slightly as she pushed her hair behind her ear. She didn't believe it. Neither did I, but pretending, forcing some kind of explanation, felt safer than accepting the truth. I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. Yeah, probably. It was a lie. We both knew it. The house felt different now, like the air inside had shifted just slightly, like the walls had stretched farther apart, even though I knew they hadn't moved at all. I turned my gaze back toward the hallway, my breath catching just slightly as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The shadows there seemed deeper than before, stretching longer than they should have, shifting ever so slightly at the edges, as if something was standing just beyond my vision. Then from deep inside the house, a sound, a slow, deliberate creak. Mia sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes darting toward mine, wide and unblinking. She had heard it too. I set my mug down carefully, barely aware of my own movements as I rose to my feet, every muscle in my body tightening as I took a slow step forward. The floor was cold beneath my feet, the kitchen light casting long, flickering shadows as I moved toward the hallway. Mia stood too, but she didn't follow. I could feel her hesitation, her fear, but I had to see. I had to know. I reached the edge of the hallway, pausing just long enough to inhale, to steady myself. Then, before I could let fear take over, I stepped inside. The darkness wrapped around me immediately, swallowing the dim kitchen light, pressing into the space between my ribs. The walls here felt closer, the air thicker, the silence heavier. I moved carefully, my pulse a steady, insistent drumbeat in my ears, my fingers brushing against the wall as I took another step forward. And then I saw it, the door to Mia's bedroom, open just slightly. It had been closed before. I was sure of it. I swallowed, my throat dry, my breath uneven. My fingers curled into fists, my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to pretend I had never walked down this hallway at all. But I couldn't, because if I turned away now, if I left that door untouched, I would never be able to shake the feeling that something was waiting behind it. I reached out, slow and careful, pressing my fingers against the wood. The surface was cold, almost unnaturally so, and for a split second, I thought I felt something press back from the other side. Then before I could pull away, it moved, not swung, not creaked, pulled, as if something on the other side had just stepped closer. I yanked my hand back, my breath catching in my throat, my body locking up as a whisper. Low, curling, almost playful, seeped through the crack in the door. It said my name, software, close, wrong. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched too long as I stumbled back toward the kitchen, my legs weak beneath me, my breath shallow. Mia was still standing near the table, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that was almost recognition, like she already knew what I had just heard. I didn't stop. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the door, fumbling with the locks, my fingers shaking too hard to get a grip. The whole house felt wrong now, like the walls were breathing, like something was pressing in around us, like the air was full of echoes that didn't belong to us. Then Mia whispered something that made my blood turn to ice. "Laura," she said, her voice barely there, her breath uneven. "I don't think it was saying your name." I turned to her, my pulse hammering, my stomach twisting into something cold and sick. "What do you mean?" She swallowed, her gaze flicking toward the dark hallway, her voice even softer now. "I think," she whispered, "it was saying mine." The air in Mia's house had changed. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt it. It was like the walls had exhaled some deep, heavy breath, like the space around us had stretched just enough to let something slip through. The kitchen, once warm and familiar, felt hollow now, as if it wasn't really part of the house anymore. Just an empty shell we had been placed inside. The weight of her words hung between us, tightening around my ribs, cold and suffocating. I think it was saying mine. Mia's voice had barely been above a whisper, but it had been enough. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, fumbling with the lock. My fingers were shaking too badly, slipping against the metal, struggling with something that should have been simple, something I had done 1,000 times before. Behind me, the hallway loomed, too dark, too quiet, stretching into something unnatural. I didn't turn around. I didn't look, because I knew. Something was there, watching, listening, waiting. Mia's breath was shallow beside me, too fast, too thin. I could feel her trembling, the way her muscles had locked up, the way her fingers curled against my wrist like a child afraid of the dark. But this wasn't the kind of darkness that could be chased away by the flick of a light switch. This was something deeper, older. Something that had been waiting long before we ever noticed it was there. The lock finally gave, the bolt sliding back with a sharp metallic snap. I yanked the door open so fast it banged against the wall, the night air rushing in around us, cold and sharp, almost too sudden after the suffocating stillness inside. We stumbled out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath our weight. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think, my breath coming in ragged gasp as I turned, shoving the door closed behind us, my hands still shaking as I twisted the lock back into place. Mia stood beside me, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring straight ahead, but not really seeing. The street was empty, the houses around us dark, still, untouched by whatever had taken root inside hers. The wind whispered through the trees lining the sidewalk, rustling the dry leaves, brushing against my skin like something I couldn't quite shake. It was quiet, too quiet, like the world had paused. I turned to Mia, my voice hoarse, unsteady. "We need to leave. Now." She nodded, but she didn't move. Not at first. I could see the hesitation, the way her body swayed just slightly, the way her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then finally she whispered, "It won't matter." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Her hands curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms. "It doesn't stop. You know that, don't you?" Her voice was soft, almost distant. "You heard it in the woods. You heard it in my house. It followed you, and now it's following me." I shook my head, swallowing hard against the nausea rising in my throat. "Number no, we're leaving. We're not staying here. We'll go somewhere else. Anywhere else." But even as I said the words, I could feel it, the truth settling into my bones. It wouldn't matter, because it wasn't about where we were. It was about who we were. Something had chosen us, marked us, and no matter where we ran, no matter how far we tried to escape, we would still hear it. Mia shuddered beside me, exhaling a slow, shaky breath. "It's still inside, isn't it?" she whispered. I turned my head, following her gaze back to the house, to the darkened windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. And I felt it too. That same heaviness, that same pressure. It hadn't followed us outside because it didn't need to. It was still inside, waiting, and sooner or later, it would call our names again. We didn't go back inside. We didn't speak. We just stood there on the porch, breathing in the cold night air, listening to the stillness stretch around us. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and uneven, could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against my skin. Mia's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the windows, unblinking, unmoving. She was waiting, and so was I, because we both knew, deep down, that this wasn't over, that it would never really be over. The house sat quiet and dark, but it wasn't empty. The walls held something now, something that had been waiting for too long, something that had taken its time settling in. I thought of the women before us, the ones who had heard their names whispered in the dark, the ones who had disappeared before anyone could understand what was really happening. And I thought of what Caldwell had said. 3 days. The whisper had come for me first, and now it had come for Mia. The wind shifted, rattling the dry leaves along the sidewalk. And just beneath it, so soft I almost thought I imagined it, came a voice, a whisper, low and curling at the edges. It said Mia's name.